difficult chapter. So if you have questions, hopefully we'll have more discussion tonight. Maybe not, but there's a lot of interesting points in this. There's a lot of different points it brings up that is really kind of interesting, really kind of deep. And so we'll see how deep we go. We'll see how many questions you have. We'll see if we make it through. Chapter 2, verse 1. Around 4 years have passed since Vashti has been disposed, that the old queen, she refused to come. She refused to go forward and be probably just paraded as a kind of, in some kind of sexual exploitation, kind of just, she refused to go. And so we read last week that the king disposes of her. There's conjecture whether she was dead or just kept away. I don't know that they killed her, but she was kept away, and she kind of leaves the scene. She's only in the scene in the chapter for one deal, and then she's gone. During that time, King Xerxes has tried to fight Greece. He's come home in humiliation. Eventually, Medo-Persia will be taken by Greece. So things aren't going swell. He's lost his queen. He's losing battles. He's kind of at a loss. And in verse 1, and we kind of touched on it right at the end last week, it says, after Xerxes' anger had subsided. We talked about that, how anger plays a role, and his anger had subsided. And again, some things seem like a big deal until time comes and kind of subsides that, right? We know what that kind of is like. There's some wisdom in not reacting straight away and just kind of taking it easy for a minute before you rashly do something. He's made this rash proclamation and it can't be changed. And so it says, after his anger had subsided, he began thinking about Vashti and what she had done and the decree he had made. I believe he looks at it and honestly think there's some probably kind of, what's the word? I think he looks with her in a bit of honor, I think there's part of him that probably respects what she did. He would never admit that. But she has stood up to him, and he has no, and again, I'll talk about this in a minute. There's a quote from Chuck Swindoll that I want to read, but this was more than just sex. I mean, he apparently had 365 concubines, one for every day of the year, and he had, let me read it here, he had 115 sons. So out of the 365 concubines, he had 115 sons. So that side of it, he was king. And basically, the idea is if he snapped his fingers, that was that, right? So there's a sexual part of it, but it wasn't just about that. I think he wanted someone by his side. Chuck Swindoll says this: the point is not that Xerxes simply needed a woman. If he were like other ancient monarchs, he had a harem full of women. Besides that, he had the power to have any woman in the kingdom. With a snap of his fingers, she'd be in his presence right there in his bedchamber. But he's not looking for a one-night encounter. He wants a wife, someone to be near him through it all, someone who would be his companion, someone who really cares long term. So I think what he's looking for is something deeper than what he's got, right? And he had that in Vashti, and I think him and Vashti were okay until she had the gall to stand up to him, right? And then things weren't as good as what he wanted. But in verse 1, you get this kind of regret, you get this thinking, but the decree had been made. And again, the Medes and the Persians, you can't reverse that. So again, watch what you promise, right? Watch what you promise the Lord. The Bible says it's better to not make a promise than to make a promise and then not do it. We're very flippant sometimes to say, God, I promise. I look at my own life and I think of the prayers and thank God for his grace and his mercy, because I've prayed things like, God, I'll never do that again. And it's like he could have said, really, because Tuesday at 4 o'clock, we're going to be right back here. And it wasn't that I was just flippantly saying I'll never do it again. I really thought I wouldn't. But guess what? Sometimes you do, right? And sometimes you have to watch what you say. You watch what you commit. Anyway, and she had done, and the decree he had made, verse 2, so his personal attendants, those people who looked after him, not the same ones that before, but they were not the ones who had told him to get rid of Vashti, but he had personal attendants. Personal attendants would look after him, look after every woman fancy he had. It says, so his personal attendants suggested, let us search the empire to find beautiful virgins for the king. Here's the problem. When you don't have God, who do you have? Yeah, you have self, you have the world, you have the flesh, nothing good, right? And throughout, this idea that keeps coming is he's a king, right? And he has everything, every lavish thing, every powerful thing. He's basically king of the world at the moment until Greece messes with him. They've disposed of Babylon. Everything's good. He's got this massive empire, those 127 provinces. It's massive, and yet he's missing something. And what he's really missing is wisdom. There's no one there to give him wisdom. He's got the eunuchs, he's got these other people, he's got these noblemen, so-called, he's got these attendants, but nobody can give him good advice because none of them have God. How great an advice can someone without God give you? So he's got nothing, right? And he keeps going back. And where did Daniel turn when he was in trouble? The Lord, right? Where we have the Lord, that he had nobody, and he keeps asking these people. It startles me sometimes, the people we ask. Like when you're in trouble, don't go to your lost friends and say, what do I do? And don't go to the ones who maybe, the people that you haven't seen at church in 3 years, they may not be the ones to go to either. Go to those people who you know are going to listen to the Lord and tell you what you need to hear, not what you want to hear, right? We all kind of like the idea of having yes men, but really that doesn't really help you. His personal attendants, again, their job was, what was their problem with his personal attendants? Who were they to look after? Him. But who did they really look after? At every opportunity they could, they would look after themselves. His personal attendants suggested, let us search the empire to find beautiful young virgins for the king. Again, all right, that might be part of it. That might be somewhat to do with what he wants. But like Chuck Swindoll says, I think it's deeper than that. And this is the world, right? You've got problems, you're missing the queen, all this is happening. He's tried to fight Greece and he's come home in defeat and despair. He's got all of this stuff going on in his life, and their answer is what? Just get a few virgins and everything will be what? No, that's what the world says, right? I mean, sex, drugs, alcohol, it'll cure all of it. Money. That's what the world teaches us still today, right? I mean, what is their answer? To get through life, to have a good time, it's drugs, it's alcohol, it's sex, it's money, it's prestige, and the biggest problem is when you get what the world tells you to have, then what? I mean, the fact, if you have to have 365 concubines somewhere, at some point you should say, it's not working, right? And look, no man can handle that. And that's clearly out of the design of God, and that's just a bad situation to be in. So that's a whole thing. Search the empire to find beautiful young virgins for the king. Notice what it doesn't say. Search for wisdom, search for strong women, search for good women. It just says search for beautiful women. Verse 3. Let the king appoint agents in each province to bring these beautiful young women into the royal harem. That can mean like a dormitory. It's like a woman's, it's kind of like you ever watch The Bachelorette? The Bible is way ahead of this. It's kind of that version of it, right? They're all living together. I mean, that's kind of what it is. Yeah, this is, The Bachelor, yeah. The Bachelor, The Bachelorette, whatever, Love Island, all these crazy stuff. All right. The word can mean a dormitory, so it's almost like all these women were living. Now imagine that. Imagine, and that's what, it's like a TV reality show it's like who can get the king? I'm not trying to be funny, but can you imagine all of these women living together? And their prize was the king, and they were all trying to outdo each other? I'm guessing there was some rivalry. I'm guessing there was some heated moments. I'm guessing there's a lot of jealousy, it's not probably a fun place to live, right? But here was the idea. We're going to have this competition. You're going to send out people. They're going to look, again, for beautiful young virgins, beautiful women, beautiful people. Bring them in and let the king pick. The problem with that is, how does he pick? How do you show off how wonderful a person you are? They didn't do an IQ test. They didn't ask you to do anything. All you had to do was walk in the bedroom, and that was it. You can fill in the blank. That was the only thing you were judged on. It's weird, right? Because we're not too far away from that in the culture now. And so this is their idea. Let the king appoint agents in each province to bring these beautiful young women into the royal harem of the fortress of Susa. So again, bring them all in. Haggai, or however you pronounce that, the king's eunuch, we talked about that last week, was in charge of the harem. Good person to have in charge of the harem. If you need to know about that, watch last week's video, right? And this is, you just can't believe what they got away with. Again, it's different ages, it's a king, it's totally different. Imagine if someone said, we want you to try out for this beauty pageant. Oh, the first thing you need is treatment for a year. I mean, I'm guessing that's not I get, if you started dating someone and said, let's not get married for a year, you need beauty treatments for a year. I'm guessing that engagement's going to be short-lived, right? I mean, it's all natural. It's all like sexual. It's all this stuff. And they said they are all given beauty treatments. I have no idea. What's funny is I have no idea what this king looks like, but I have in this idea he was portly and not very good looking himself. It's just kind of the way it would be, right? He's not this like 6'5" stud with, abs. And I mean, I have no proof. I have no idea what he looks like. But if I was casting him in a movie, that would be who I would cast. Anyway, that's just an extra one for free. All right. Every one of them is to be given beauty treatments. Look, they don't ask them to interview. They don't ask them, they just want someone for that. After that, verse 4, the young woman who most pleases the king will be made queen instead of Vashti. Again, what does it mean most pleases the king? The one who he finds something in it. Now, if he is looking for something deeper, maybe there is a sexual part, and then he speaks to them. I don't know. You've got one night. It ends up being you've got one night. That's it. One night. And Esther gets herself in a bit of and this is where there's a whole lot of thinking we need to do in this chapter, because she gets herself in a mess. We'll learn. But look at what it says. This advice was very appealing to the king. Wow, that's a shock. You're offering a man free sex with all of these women, and it appealed to him. Well, there's a shock, isn't it? I mean, it's fleshly, it's wrong. I mean, and he's the king, right? Remember what God, and this is part of why Scripture is difficult to understand sometimes. Even with King David, King Solomon, remember what ended up messing up King Solomon? The foreign wives. Yeah, too many concubines. I'm telling you, men can't handle that. All right, what did God say? And again, God makes these rules. People blow them away, and he's very gracious and merciful, but it doesn't mean that you can just break the rule. And what I mean by that is, God is very clear. When they ask for a king, he's like, you can have a king, but before we go down that road, you have to understand what is going to happen. And the king is going to take your daughters. The king is going to take your mighty young men. Basically, the king is going to have all of the... It's basically designed so that when they hear that, they're like, we're better with you, God. They hear all of these things, and they're like, cool, we want a king. Part of the thing on the kings was you cannot multiply horses or wives. Don't have a massive amount of horses, and don't have a massive amount of wives. Why? Why would that be a rule? Especially the horses. Why? Okay, it stands for power. Why would God not want the king to have power?
He goes to his head. He becomes God in himself.
There's part of the problem. He becomes God himself. It takes power, and it really takes the power away from who? God wants to be the power. That was a power struggle. I've been your king perfectly. You are now saying everyone else has a king that they can see. We want a king, and God's like, that's not a good idea. And remember... Samuel is like, it's not a good idea. But God's like, they're not coming after you, they're coming after me. And he says, don't make much of yourself. And David and Solomon obviously busted out that rule. There's an interesting question. Why did God seem to allow it? And did David pay for that? I would suggest that David's mess with Bathsheba came from that. In other words, when you are used to getting what you want, and you've opened up Pandora's box, and you start seeing women as a way to fulfill that need, when he saw Bathsheba, guess what he thought? And he wasn't you. When you're used to getting what you want, listen, that's the definition of being spoiled, right? People who are used to getting what they want, and what happens when they don't get what they want? Nothing good, right? And I believe David would have been rescued from Bathsheba. I don't think David would have had the same problem, but he's sowing this sin. The question is, why didn't God just zap him? Why didn't he make him like unable to do it? Why is it see, people read the Bible like it's no big deal, but it is a massive deal. I don't know all that God does that. All I'm telling you is David didn't get away with that. I don't know. This is why I'm not God, because if I said don't have multiple wives and he's sleeping around, I'd probably do something to him. God doesn't, but he pays for it. And Solomon, that's his whole downfall, is these foreign women, is this different. It's just, what was Israel's problem? They married foreign women, and God's rules. And again, there's rules for Jews. There's dietary rules. There's moral rules. And all of this comes up in Esther. But he says, the woman who most pleases the king will be made queen. Now, what's funny about that is you think, man, the king has a lot of power. But guess who chooses who the king is? And God even says, you can have a king, but I'm going to what? He never lets Israel pick the king. God is always the one over all of that. And so when it says, let the king make the choice, that's playing into his ego, that's playing into his... But at the end of the day, the only reason he chose Esther was because God gave her grace for him to choose her. God moves like that. God is powerful like that. Guess what? If God wants you to choose Esther, guess who you're picking? Yeah, so it's free will, but God's... That's that mixture of free will and sovereignty of God, and he's just moving it all around. It's like, you can choose anyone you want, but God's telling his angels, I bet he chooses Esther. He's going to. This advice was very appealing to the king, so he put the plan into effect. Nice guy, huh? Look at verse 5. At that time, there was a Jewish man in the fortress of Susa whose name was Mordecai, son of Jair. So Mordecai enters the picture now. Mordecai is going to be a really important part of this story. He was from where? He was from the tribe of Benjamin. That's really important. So he's from Judah. He's a Jew. He was from the tribe of Benjamin and was the descendant of Kish. Who's Kish? I believe that's Saul's father. And Shimei. His family had been among those. Listen to, and this again, I probably don't have enough time and enough, but I want us to think about this. We're introduced to this man named Mordecai. The first thing we're told about him is who his dad is. But then what are we told? He is from the tribe of Benjamin. He's a descendant of Kish, and his family had been among those who, with King Jehoiachin of Judah, had been exiled from Jerusalem to Babylon by King Nebuchadnezzar. Remember in 605 it starts, and Judah is taken over by Babylon because God allows it to happen. And Babylon takes them for how long? For 70 years, right? You end up at like 535. Here we're at what? Where are we at? About 482. So you're talking about 100 years. And here's what I find really interesting. After the 70 years, so they've had Mordecai's family were from the tribe of Benjamin. He had been with the king, Jehoiachin of Judah. They'd been exiled. His family had been exiled to Babylon. So it's over 70 years. Here's what's really interesting to begin with. They could have left. They could have left Babylon. Remember, after 70 years, what happened? Cyrus makes a decree, and everybody who wants to go can what? So here, I don't know how old Mordecai is. I don't know how into that, but his family makes a decision to stay in what was Babylon, which is then overtaken by the Medes and the Persians. Do you see that none of this would have happened to them? That they wouldn't have to fight the battle? They're in pagan territory. A man's going to come after the Jews. You know where you could have been? You could have been home. You could have been home, but home had... Why didn't they go home? I mean, only, what was it, 50,000, something like that originally went? It's not very many. Why did so few, when we've read it with Esther and all of that, and why did so few Jewish people, when they're allowed to leave? That's the perfect word. What were they comfortable with? They had, and there was comfort, right? And you're 100%. There was also, remember, you have to go through Esther to rebuild the temple and all that. And then you get to Nehemiah and they're rebuilding the wall. So at first, when they went back, what did they have? So you had to be on the ground. It's amazing how many people are not willing to see the long term and don't want to be on the front end of stuff. Yeah, and do the work. Yeah, there was physically nothing for them in Jerusalem, and so they stayed. So God is moving people. God is calling people. And again, I did a study with my mom on Zoom, and there was different discussions on this, and she wasn't as harsh on them staying as I was. I thought they should have go. Anyway, she's wrong sometimes. It's okay. But why? I just don't understand why you wouldn't go. I mean, I get why they don't go. What I mean is I don't get that there's a really good excuse not to go. But Mordecai finds himself in Persia, and God uses him, and God does some amazing things. But Mordecai's in Persia because Babylon took over the Jews, and after they were allowed home, his family made a decision, we're staying. And the Bible tells us his family had been exiled from Jerusalem by King Nebuchadnezzar. Verse 7, look at what the Bible says. This man had a very beautiful and lovely young cousin, Hadash. Now, this is really, really interesting because let me look here. There's different names. Let me get this right. The name Esther is Persian. The name Esther is a Persian name. But her other name, which we're going to learn, it means myrtle branches, or the name of a beautiful fragrant tree. They carried, and this wasn't uncommon for Jewish people in Persia, they had a Jewish name and they had a Persian name. Esther means star. It's connected to all kinds of weird gods and all of that. So her Persian name was Esther. Her Jewish name is what we're going to learn here. Look at what it says. This man, Mordecai, had a very beautiful and lovely young cousin. Josephus goes on and on about how pretty Esther was. They reckon she was one, along with Sarah and others, one of the 4 most beautiful women of the world. So we're not talking about like she was okay looking. She's a type that if she walks in a room, every man gets googly-eyed. I mean, she was really, really beautiful. And I believe that, and I believe that's part of this story. And look at what it says. The Bible just says she's beautiful, and she's what? She's beautiful, but she's also what? Lovely, this says. She was a cousin of Mordecai. Hadash, which is her Jewish name, was called Esther. When her father and mother died, Mordecai adopted her into his family and raised her as his own daughter. So here's Mordecai. He's her uncle. He adopts her. He raises her as his own daughter. And so God's made this provision. Mordecai comes. She's lost her mom and dad, and God puts Mordecai right there. And Mordecai adopts her into his family, and he raises her as her own daughter. And what you're going to find throughout this whole story, is that she is very, very loyal to Mordecai. When you talk about submission and being loyal and taking advice, Esther, will see a number of times, is one that took advice pretty well. The advisor is going to give her advice, and she takes it. Mordecai is basically kind of, it sounds bad, but he's kind of in control of her. I mean, what he says goes. And she listens to Mordecai. She obviously has a lot of respect for Mordecai. She obviously loves Mordecai, and he's helped her. Uncle has helped her. He stepped in. He's done what he needed to do. Her mom and dad have died. And Mordecai has adopted her and raised her as his own daughter. And here's where it gets interesting. And here's where I don't fully know, and maybe you can add what you want to add. As a result of the king's decree, so the king has made this decree, right? And over all of this, God is sovereign. Esther, along with many young women, was brought to the king's harem at the fortress of Susa and placed in Heggai's care. So here's the question. Why is Esther going? If you lost this concubine, if you lost this competition, you basically became a concubine. Part of this idea is that all of these women are going to come. Whoever wins is going to be queen. The losers, you don't get to see again. They stay with the king, and they are just simply used as concubines. So the question becomes, did the king's decree make it where they said, you, and she had to go? Or did Mordecai agree and think, there's a good idea, I'll send Esther? What do you think? See, this is what I mean. This gets interesting, right? Does anyone have an opinion? Philip, come on. Okay, so maybe she is. Maybe she's ordered to come. But, okay, so if that's the truth, did she have to go? I get it. And that holds until later, until we find. Hold that thought, because it holds for now.
She was respecting her adoption.
That might be part of it. That might be. Okay, and if that's the case, I'm going because Mordecai's told me to go. What in God's green earth is Mordecai thinking?
Why would he send her?
Okay, so he's either sending her because there's a benefit of having her be queen. But in how to get to be queen, this is what I'm telling you. See, your brain's already turning, isn't it? Mine's been turning all week. And every time I read something, it just made me more confused. So I just decided, all right, just think about all of this, though, right? And I go back, and again, you remember with the spies in Joshua? And we get into this whole conjecture. Did they have to lie? Now, again, it's confused. Does God bless lying? I would say no. Does God ever allow a lie? No. If you start accepting that God allows a lie, you're going to go down a bad path pretty quick. Oh, it's just a white lie. Here's what I'm telling you. This is complicated. Did God bless the spies in Joshua? Is that my phone? Or is did he bless the spies? He kept them alive, right? Here's a big question. Did they have to lie? I get why they did it. I'm not telling you in the same position. It's easy to stand here and say, but what happens if they told the truth? Can God not save them? Sometimes, what I'm telling you is this, and I don't like telling these stories because it's not about making me look. There are times when you have to practice what you preach. There are times when you do things just because you think it's the right thing to do, even though it's crazy. There was in Odessa, I can say it now because I'm not there anymore, but our house had a very, very old security system, and it didn't work. It never worked. It was ancient. And it never worked. We just never had an alarm system, right? So I didn't have an alarm, and I didn't want to say, you could buy one of those. We're alarm buy, but that's not true. So we just never had an alarm. Well, then this kid comes and knocks on the door, and he's trying to sell me an alarm system. Guess what? The one thing I don't want him... And by the way, there's been a thing of burglaries all around, right? And they're scoping out houses. And they get in your house and say, oh, we can fit this. And they look all around, and they know exactly what you got, where it got, and all of a sudden your stuff's missing. All right? So what information do you think I didn't want to share with him? In the course of conversation, the dude says, do you have an alarm system? Everything within me is wanting to shut the door, make something up. I'm like, yeah, but it's old and doesn't work. And at that moment, your flesh is like, idiot. And He's like, it doesn't work? I was like, no. Long story short, I shut the door and said, Lord, you're going to have to help me. He's about to rob my house, ain't he? But guess what? He didn't. What I'm saying is that there are times where you just think, the guy's going to rob my house. I've got to make up a story. I've got to say something. I have no proof. I'll go to my grave believing the Lord protected me, even when right? I'm better off doing that than I am lying. So me and Dwayne have sat many times discussing this stuff, and it's really interesting to me. I love discussing that stuff, but I don't know how she ended up here. I know God is sovereign. I know all of that's going to happen. Does anyone have any questions or any thought? I mean, when you think about, lots of people disagree with me about Joshua, and they're okay with them lying or whatever. I'm just telling you, if they had said the spies, if Rahab had said, the spies are up on my, we automatically think then God can't do what, he could have done it. And again, there's common, I get it. I get it's hard. Like if someone came in my house and said, is your wife home?
How were the Jews being treated at this time?
Well, that's really interesting. They can't have been treated that bad, because if they were treated that bad, they would have, when they could, right? Babylon seduced you by their stuff. When Babylon took Assyria, when Assyrians took you, they made you convert or conform by stringing dead bodies up and stuff. Assyria was brutal. Assyria would win you by fear. Does that make sense? So if you came against the Assyrians, they'd just kill you. They'd come at you, and you basically you did what the Assyrians wanted you to do because of fear. Babylon had a totally different way of doing it. It's kind of interesting. Babylon just seduced you. So you would come as a Jew, right? I'm not going to eat that. Oh, just try it. Oh, no. Sabbath is special. Oh, do what you want on the Sabbath. Oh, this God said, well, you can have many gods. But I'm not allowed to sleep with them. Sleep with them. And Babylon seduced you by all of their what? All their worldly stuff. When you came to visit Babylon, they threw out the royal carpet, the red carpet, so that you would what? It's two totally different ways, but you see how you get seduced either way? So I don't think the Jews were... Now, Jews over history, they're about to have problems. I mean, the devil's coming after the Jews now in this story. But I think previous, in Babylon especially, and again, it's complicated, because in Jeremiah, God says, you're going to be there for 70 years, so settle down, build your houses, you're going to be there. I don't want to say make the most of it, but you're going to be part of that. I don't think the Jews have probably never had it easy, but I don't think it was bad in Babylon. And they could have gone. They could have left. Right? There was no one really holding them there. So, does anyone have any questions, thoughts, ideas? Told you this is going to get interesting. If you're not confused before you came in, you might be when you leave. All right. Look at what it says. So Mordecai adopts her. Esther, along with many other young women, was brought to the king's harem. Again, just think of a woman's unit, like a dormitory, like a place for all the women. At the fortress of Susa, and placed in this guy's care. Verse 9. Haggai was very impressed with Esther and treated her kindly. Again, this is why it gets... Why does he really like Esther? The guy's a eunuch, so it's not about that stuff. Why does this guy like Esther? Why does he treat her kindly? Do you remember what happens with Joseph? He finds what? He finds favor. Daniel finds what? This is grace. She literally finds the grace of God. This is where it gets really complicated. Part of me thinks you should never be there. Like, Mordecai, what were you smoking? What are you doing? Esther, why would you want to be a part of this? And I don't have a problem with saying, God put her there, apart from the competition rules, which is you have to sleep with the king. That's where it gets dicey. I'm okay with God placing her in a difficult situation. He does that all the time. Imagine if your kid came home, especially your daughter, and said, God's calling me to this. What's he calling you to? Well, it's this great calling, but I've got to sleep with this guy. What would you say? God's all over. Do you see what I'm saying? God's all over this. God has given her favor. And yet, the whole thing's kind of strange. But he's impressed with Esther. He treats her kindly. So even if she's messed up, God is very gracious. But it doesn't mean he winks at sin either. It doesn't mean like, oh, never mind. He quickly ordered a special menu for her and provided her with beauty treatments. He assigned her, listen to this, 7 maids specially chosen from the king's palace, and he moved her and her maids into the best place in the harem. So Esther is having a ball. It's all good. You're getting the beauty treatments. You got 7 maids. For a Jew, that must have been amazing, right? Now the Persians are serving who? Now they're serving me. 7 of them, not 1, 7. 7 maids, specially chosen from the king's palace, and she got the best place. She got the best part, whatever that is, the best part. You can see, what do you think this did for relations with the other women? How much do you think they enjoyed Esther? How many women do you think were like, I'm glad Esther got special treatment. I wanted her to get it. I'm so glad that wasn't me. I mean, when you're in a competition, an old girl walks in and she's the favored one, you're already in trouble. They're not hiding the fact that and it's strange because he's a eunuch, so it's not a sexual thing, but it's a God thing. And he looks at, and it really means, in the original language, she found grace. She found grace. Grace of what? The grace of God. Verse 10. This is where it gets weird. If it hasn't been already weird. How much should a Jew stand out in Persian culture? Let me ask you this. How much should a Christian stand out today? If people don't know you're a Christian, forget just what you're saying. If people look at you and have no idea you're a Christian, what does that infer? You're no different, which means what? We probably act the same, talk the same, do the same things, have the same. Peter says we're a very peculiar people. But we stand out. A Jew would really stand out, right? On the Sabbath, they'd stand out. By the way they acted, they'd stand out. By the way they dressed, they would stand out. By the way they ate, they would stand out. Their morals would make them stand out. And yet nobody knows she's a Jew. Which means what? See, does God call you to go covert? Like, hey, I know you're Jewish, but shh. Some see, we'll find out the reason she hasn't told anyone. Guess who told her to say that? Mordecai. Now some think Mordecai's a hero and he's protecting her and woo. And what happens later kind of justifies that. But again, why are you scared of saying she's a Jew? In fact, the worst is going to happen. Death threats and all of this, and God's just going to what? God's going to protect them. Sometimes, I've been told by my wife, and she's right, that when you leave off part of the stories, you may not have lied by what you said, but you can lie by what you leave out. I'm not telling you more than that, all right? Did you take out the trash? Yes. We had this discussion in Odessa. Did you take out the trash? Yes. What she meant was, did you walk all the back round here and go to the dumpster and dump it in? But she asked, did I take out that? What I did do is step out the back door and just put it out there and I'll figure I'll get it later. So she asked, did I take out the trash? Yeah, I took out the trash. Because I did. I took out the trash. Opens back door, there's the trash. You know what she learned to ask? Did you take the trash out and take it to the dumpster? Now I can. Anyway, enough of my confession. Look at what it says. Esther hadn't told anyone of her nationality and family background because Mordecai directed her not to do so. So why is Mordecai telling her that? Anyone want to have conjecture on that? Why is he telling her, don't tell you're Jewish? You see, we have all these thoughts of, if that happens, then this happens. If I tell them I'm Jewish, I'm dead. Well, guess what? They're going to find out. And what's weird is Mordecai has confessed to being Jewish. We'll read that. Mordecai's people that he worked with knows he's Jewish. And that sets off this whole thing. He's told her, don't tell anyone. So physically, humanly speaking, you get it. But is that right or is that wrong? I mean, are you scared?
How long had they been in Persia?
Well, his family had been there over 100 years. I mean, his family had come from King Nebuchadnezzar in about 605, and we're at 483 or whatever. So he'd been there 100 odd years. His family, I don't know how old Mordecai was and all of that, but his family made a decision. I can tell you his family has been in, Babylon, which got taken over by Medes and the Persians for 100 years. So his ancestors that were there probably dead, right? So whether it was his granddad or whatever was part of. So how do I make this analogy? We kind of do these things of, I'm just not going to tell him I'm a Christian, because if I tell him I'm a Christian, then this is going to happen. Here's a question for you. Does God ever tell you, shh, don't tell him you're a Christian? Because if you tell him you're a Christian, I can't help you.
Maybe they didn't ask.
Maybe. But if that's the case, if they didn't ask, it's because she wasn't Jewish. In other words, if she was flagrantly Jewish, they wouldn't have even had to ask, they would have known. Does that make sense? Like, Israel has always been different by everything they do. That was the whole point of Israel. Different methods of everything. The way you dress, the way you think, your festivals. They're all intrinsically different, so that when you looked at God's people, you knew they were God's people. So if they didn't ask, that infers to me that she was covert and no one had any reason to ask, because they weren't any different or they didn't see anything. You would imagine, maybe it's she's getting favored, so that, if this is politics, they're going to pull up any dirt on her they can. And if they find out she's Jewish, maybe that hurts. Does that? Now everyone's confused, don't they? This is what I'm telling you. This book is really challenging. Had I known this, we may not have been studying Esther. I mean, this is really no, it's good. I'm just joking. But it's interesting. And if you have questions, let's deal with them. If they don't know she's Jewish, at some point she had to be well hidden somehow, yes. That would be like me coming over. I don't know how you'd pull it off and making sure that no one knew I was British. I mean, the first thing, the way I say the word, that would be hard. Forget the accent. It's just hard. Especially if you got into American history of that, I'd be like, Oh, correct. Yeah, she's a Jew. It's anyway. But it says, and this is weird, it's like Esther is such a good character in ways, and then there's questions about it. But she is, again, I told you, she's very submissive. And we know why. Because Mordecai is a great guy in some ways, because he's adopted her. He's done what he needed. He's brought her up, right? And she's obviously close to Mordecai, and what Mordecai says goes. Again, the problem with unwavering submission is if who you're unwaveringly submitting to go bad, then you go bad with it. Does that make sense? I mean, again, Mordecai doesn't have the right to make her submit to things that aren't. And I get the argument that the king made her, but here, let me ask this. Again, one question leads to 50 others. Can Esther stand in front of God one day and say, the king made me? And him free pass. I get it. I understand that form of thinking. And again, look, it's easy for me to stand here when a king's not making me. But does that give you can you stand in front of God and say, I didn't want to do it, but the king made me? You understand the culture we were in. I just don't think that, at the end, I just don't think that flies. Now, again, go ahead.
Certain situations, unless you've been in them, like especially mentally, you can be where you begin to be controlled if you're around it, and that's what you do, and that's what you do, like her, and she respected him because he had protected her and raised her and stuff, and then she may not want to do that, but I mean, she really feels like she doesn't have a choice, and you say that you do, and she could have chose not to go, but you trusted him, and not just that, but, and you say, unless I was physically making you, you know what I'm saying, you can't say that someone was making you, like you didn't have a choice, that would
Let
be
me
the
ask
only way
this,
you think.
I'm following that, and does God hold us accountable for our mental competence in situations? I mean, and I think that's kind of where Mr. Chrissy was going. He holds us accountable till we're of the age of accountability, right? In our mental age, growth. But if a woman is in a submissive or a controlled relationship, or Mordecai has maybe even brainwashed her into thinking that the royal favor is all she needs, and that she, get this at any cost. And then her mental competence is, kind of, been like taken away in a sense. You know what I'm saying?
I don't think she's mentally incompetent, though. She's fully. Again, Vashti has done what no one could thought she could do, right? And it didn't work. Vashti got disposed because God wanted to dispose her. So you can't look at Vashti and say, see, look, when you go against the king, this is what happens. Well, of course it's what happens because God was going to do something different. We'll get into it, but maybe we're all assuming, by the way, and this might sound strange, we're all assuming, and I guess the text probably indicates that she slept with him, but what happens if she says, we're not doing that? Like I said, this is a really interesting scenario. It's really, you start to think about what, I just don't think she can stand, I understand, I don't understand much of the culture, I haven't been in it. I understand, but at some point you have to take personal accountability. You can't say, they made me. And I think as Christians, we can never even say the devil made me because he gives us a way out. Does God bless us even when, remember in Timothy it says, God is, when we are not faithful, he is. And God uses imperfect people because he has to. If he looks at Esther and says, you messed up, I'm not going to use you, then I'm out. Everybody that's ever taught here is out. All of us are out. At the same time, I kind of wish the story was she refused and God put her in anyway. Mordecai gets promoted. Mordecai has this position in this kind of government. And it says in verse 10, or 11, every day Mordecai would take a walk near the courtyard of the harem to find out about Esther and what was happening to her. He was find out that he's been hired. And it doesn't mean he got into places because of his position that not anybody could get into. It's kind of like he's walking around the Oval Office. And when you walk around the Oval Office, he wasn't like, the king's major guy, but he's in office at the moment. He's going to get a promotion, but there's this side of Mordecai that seems to be, how do you know he knows it's dangerous or not a great situation? He checks on her what? How often does he check on her? Now, that could be out of love or it could be out of what? Yeah. Yeah, well, okay, yeah.
Or
Guilt. Every day he's checking on her. Look at what it says. Every day Mordecai would take a walk near the courtyard of the harem. He'd get in close to find out about Esther and what was happening to her. So he's asking people, he's listening, and he wants to know what's happening to Esther. Now, if it's going wrong, what's he going to do? If you're scared of the king, then what are you going to do anyway? At some point, you're going to have to trust the Lord, right? All right, let's go verse 12. Before each young woman was taken to the king's bed, she was given the prescribed 12 months of beauty treatment, 6 months with oil of myrrh, followed by 6 months with special perfumes and ointments. Can you imagine? This is crazy. 6 months of oil, 6 months of perfumes and ointment. All for what? All for the king's pleasure, also that you'll be the one chosen. 12 months of beauty treatments. Verse 13. Here's this moment. Is the year ordained of God? Is that a time to... You got to think that there's a reason it's been this long. In fact, I think it's like... Isn't it 7 years or so? There's a long time. I want to say 7. I'll go back and look. But there's a time, this elapses now, where she has to go. Look, in verse 13, she's done all the preparation. All the stuff has happened. When it was time for her to go to the king's palace, it's that day. What would you be thinking as Esther? It's one thing to think about it. It's one thing to talk about it. But there is a day. There is a day that now you have to go and do what you need to do. Listen, J. Vernon McGee? Listen to what he says. I must say that at this particular juncture, I do not have much respect for Mordecai. Before the story is over, I'm going to change my mind and I'll eat my words. But right now, I despise him for what he's doing. To begin with, he's disobeying God. God had told his people not to intermarry with the heathen. He is definitely breaking the Mosaic law by entering this girl in the beauty contest on the chance that she might become the next queen. So that's what he thinks. The girls who did not win the contest would automatically enter the harem of the king. If Esther lost, she would be forced to become a concubine. She would be exposed to an awful life, but Mordecai is willing to take that risk. That's his view on it. All right. Listen, this is kind of funny, that when it's your chance, you get to choose whatever clothing or jewelry you wanted to take. What are they thinking? The better the clothes, the more jewelry, what? I need clothes and jewelry to what? To help my chances. Right? And they're offering clothes and jewelry because there's no expense. If the king likes it, great. Listen to this, verse 14. How do you think she's feeling? Probably, yeah. That evening, she was taken to the king's private room. And the next morning, she was brought to the second harem where the king's wives lived. There she would be under the care of the king's eunuch in charge of the concubines. She would never go to the king again unless he had especially enjoyed her and requested her by name. I don't think he even knew the names of hardly any of them. But here's the rules set out. You go to the king's bed, you wake up the next morning, and now you go to the next harem. Now you go to the next section. You go to the I've done that section, right? And the only way you ever get to see the king again is if he asks for you by what? So if he doesn't ask your name, you know what? You're done lost. Because if he doesn't know your name, he ain't calling for you. You imagine doing all of that. Beauty treatments for a year, the clothes, the jewelry, you sleep with him, and you never see him again. And in fact, your only worth now is to be a concubine. The rules of this competition are really rough, right? And look what it says, unless he had especially enjoyed her. That's hard to differentiate yourself when you're sleeping with that many people. I'm not being funny, but he must have seen he's seen all of it. Whatever his fancy, he had it. Verse 15, Esther was the daughter of Abihail, who was Mordecai's uncle. Mordecai had adopted his younger cousin Esther. when it was Esther's turn to go to the king, she accepted the advice. Remember, now this is funny, the eunuch in charge, he really liked who? He liked Esther. This is what I mean. There's this submissive side of Esther who listens. He said to her, she accepted the advice. Remember what everyone's trying to do? Find the clothing and find the jewelry. She asked for nothing except what he suggested, and she was admired by everyone who saw her. In other words, she said, tell me what to do and I'll just what? I'll just do it. Most women would be in there saying, I'm having this color and I want this jewelry. She said she would go, she asked the eunuch, she accepted the advice. She asked for nothing except what he suggested. He said, wear this, do that. And she said, yes, sir. And on she went. Verse 16. Esther was taken to King Xerxes at the royal palace. Here we go. Of the 7th year of his reign. That's where I was getting 7 from. So that was 4 years. So she waited 3 years. If we were in the 4th year at the verse, we're about 3 years in. After that, she finally, so he's been in power 7 years. And she finally gets, in the early winter, and even in that, this is going to sound wild, but this is what, in the winter, it was better to be chosen in the winter than in the summer. The summer was boiling, the summer was hot, it was more, how do I say this graciously? It was more, it was better to have a partner in the cold than it was in the heat. Anyway. Yeah. But look, so even that, and even forget all that, just that moment, that timing, God's over all of this but look at what it says. And the king loved Esther. There you go. You already know that's coming. The king loved Esther more than any of the other young women. Why? Why? Because God gave her grace. And God wanted her to be picked. Now, again, I can't come to tell myself that it was fine what she did. And I don't think God just winks at that. But the king loved Esther more than any of the other young women. He was so delighted with her that he set the royal crown on her head and declared her queen. One time did it. He loved her. He chose her. It's done. Here's the question, and I know we're running out of time. Was that the only way she could become queen? Would you look at Esther and say, you have to sleep with him? It's the only way. Now, before you start thinking that, think of it as your daughter. Would you ever look at your daughter and say, I know it's wrong, I know it's not ideal, but trust me, we have to. You can answer or do something. I mean, what do you say to that? I'm of the opinion she could say no and see what happens. And by the way, I don't think God's ever said, how dare you be so faithful and so strong? Zap. Now, could you, yeah, look, imagine, what did the 3 Hebrew boys do? We don't care, throw us in. And guess who showed up and saved them? How many people would have said, and by the way, why are they the only 3 Jewish people? You realize that it was more than 3, right? But 3 of them stood and said, we're not going to lie. All the other Jews would tell them what? You have to do. Can you imagine? Just bow. You don't have to mean it. Just bow. And 3 of them refused. Go ahead.
All the way from her being found to be beautiful and everything, to the day to go into the king. Did she have a choice?
I think God called her to be queen. I'm not sure that she had to settle for the way she made herself, got to be queen. Does that make sense? I cannot tell. I can't in good conscience tell. I mean, I would never look at Landry and say, you have to. I'm sorry, you have to. At some point, at some point you got to trust the Lord. And he just, my mom's always said, you'll never lose if you put God first. I mean, if you really trust the Lord and really say, I'm not going to do this in honor of you. I'm going to trust you. I know, God, if God wants her to be queen, he can do it in different ways. This story is really difficult because clearly she was like, God has his hand on her. But you don't have to force your way in or manipulate the situation. If God's going to call you somewhere, he can do it. Even if you tell, here it is. Let's make it a bit more modern, a bit more. What do you do on a pastor search team? When you ask a pastor a question, how honest do you want them to be? Okay, what happens if he lies on that to get the job? There are certain answers you have to give that you know are going to kill your job chances. But here's what I'm telling you. There are answers I can give that are honest that are going to mess my chances up. But if God's called me here, I'll still get it. And better for me to do that than to say I had to tell them that. There are some questions that you get asked that you know what they want the answer to be. Hey, how are you with 20-minute sermons? Not good. I mean, what's the point of saying, yeah, I'm with 20-minute sermons and then getting here and giving you 50 minutes? You see there's a problem? And we get into that mindset of if I tell them the truth, I won't get it. And some of that is, look, it.
I'd rather you tell me the truth and let me deal with that than lie to me, because I'm going to find out anyway, and then you're going to have to deal with me. Either way.
I'm just trying to put it in what I deal with, in what other people. And we're getting out of time. But here's another one, and I'll pick on pastors because I am one. You know what a lot of other pastors do? They say, and I didn't do that, before you start this is not what I just did. But they'll tell you, I'm going on vacation. You know what that means? I'm going to another church in view of a call, and if I get it, then here's a problem with that. Here's why I can't do that. And you can hold me to this, record it, hold me to it. If another church tells me we want you to come and interview, or we want you to come in view of a call, I will 100% tell you. The reason people don't do that is because if I don't get it, I want what? And it's very difficult to be like, listen, I'm sure if I stood up and said 2 weeks ago I was interviewing and didn't get the job, can I still stay? People are going to be hacked off. People don't want to know that you're flirting with some other church, right? But you know what you have to do? You know what's worse? You have to come back. And how do you, when you come back, say, by the way, I'm being called somewhere else? When did you interview? Last week? On vacation? You see, it's going to come out. And I've seen this over and over and over again. Just tell the truth. And if God, sometimes you're just going to hear them out. Tell it. Because when you come back, hey, if you fire me, you fire me. But fire me for going there and telling the truth and not for lying to you. Does that make sense? And anyway, now, does anyone have any questions, thoughts? I would say it's exciting to get to dinner, but it's a salad bar, so I mean,